mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. The DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Katie Burke, and today on this show, I have Len Guldman. He is a call collector, firearm specialist or dealer, a decoy collector, which I still don't know what he collects, but we will get into it. All right, welcome to the show, Len.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you for having me.
All right, so where do we begin? As I said this earlier to you off air, but I got set up for this interview through Ryan Graves. He's a good friend of the podcast. He's come on once before two times before. He's a repeat guest.
A repeat guest.
Yes, I had him on when I interviewed John Stevens, which we are here in Stuttgart at Callapalooza. My first visit to Callapalooza, but
I've been here 3 years out of the 5 that they've had it. It's a really great event that John Stevens here at RnT puts on for call makers and collectors. It's primarily aimed at current call makers and giving them an opportunity to show their wares, share talents, and it's just a great event that's put on this time of year.
Okay, so I have a question about this. I've asked this to a few people. I know quite a few, and I've had them on the podcast, quite a few contemporary decoy makers. Cameron McIntyre, Marty Hansen. I just interviewed Jerry Tollison. I know George Drunk. I've been to his place. One of the things that comes up with decoy makers versus, there's a lot more contemporary call makers, right, than there are decoy makers. So what my question is, because there's 2 types, 3 types of decoy makers. You have your decorative decoy makers, which I really don't put them in the same category but there's 2 types of gunning decoy makers, right? There's
Correct.
More mass-produced, they're turning things on a lathe, and then you have these guys like Cameron and Marty and Jerry who are
chisels and files.
Yes.
And, yeah.
Okay. So what do you think why there's such a narrow entrance into decoy making versus into call making? Why is there so many more people going into calls versus decoys?
Well, I think that's a fairly easy question to answer. A duck call, average using call, is going to be acrylic, fairly easy and quick to produce, whether it's by a CNC machine or hand turned on a lathe. It's going to be a whole lot easier to do that and a lot cheaper to market than a hand-carved decoy. Right.
So then I guess let's say versus custom calls. So are there versus custom calls rather than the mass more? How would that differ?
Well,
does it?
It definitely does. You've got a lot of different forms of the higher-end custom calls, whether they be checkered, scrimshawed, materials are made out of, a lot of that type of thing. So the price is going to go up relative to the hours that it took to make it.
Okay.
So you get a guy hand carving a decoy, it's probably going to be about the same hours as a guy making a high-end contemporary duck call that's checkered and raised panels and that type of thing, beautiful woods. I actually have a full set of Marty Hansen decoys that I gun
He
over.
makes calls as well.
And he makes some phenomenal calls, super talented guy.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a question that would be relevant to ask him because he can do both.
Right, that's true. And that's very rare.
Yeah, that is. There's not a lot of guys that make both decoys and calls, and you can look back through history, and that's the case as well. Back to the turn of the last century, you had a few guys like Charlie Purdue. He made decoys, he made duck calls.
Right.
Skippy Bartow in the 50s made decoys and he made duck calls because they kind of went hand in hand.
Yeah, but why do you think they didn't do it? Like, why do you think? Like, okay, so to give a little back, so I know why they didn't on the East Coast because calls making was just not a tradition on that.
Correct.
It's a Mississippi flyaway specific tradition. Now it has grown to be the Pacific flyaway, but it started and was primarily Mississippi flyaway. So I understand why, because decoy, was born in the East Coast. But why do you think for the Mississippi flyaway they didn't necessarily do both?
I think that it started with more. Of course, Indians used calls that they made out of reeds to call ducks, and that was more of a plains thing. But I think that decoys became very, very popular in the Great Lakes and on south. And then you get call makers really didn't start until you hit Illinois. And some of the great call makers early days came from Illinois, but then on south from there.
Yeah.
So you get into Tennessee, Arkansas, but the original older calls, they were Illinois.
Yeah, so that might be the answer right there is that, so in Illinois, that's like Purdue. He's an Illinois call maker. He did decoys and he did calls. And then as you go into Tennessee and Arkansas, you didn't need decoys. So maybe that's the answer is that just location and opportunity.
Correct.
Is why they did.
You get here and it's the stopping ground. So you've got millions of ducks versus up there, you're catching them coming through. So, yeah. And
you're hunting them in timber here. So by the time they've committed to the timber,
pretty much,
you don't need a decoy to bring them all the way in.
Yeah, you rely on kicking the water and they're not using their vision, but they are using their ears.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because, then Marty, of course, is Wisconsin. So that's a different situation as well.
Well, Marty does it because he loves it. And he's very, very good.
He is. He was one of my very first interviews, actually.
Great guy.
Yes, I love Marty. And I was very sad. I think this is the first year I haven't seen him in Chicago in a very long time.
I did not make it to Chicago.
And he would have been so surprised because you don't know this about me, but I've had 3 kids. And every time I see him, I'm pregnant. And he's like, why do you keep... So he'd have been very shocked to see a skinny me. So I'd like to know a little bit more, like with this, you've been to Chicago to that, and then this event. So can you describe kind of how, since I haven't been here, what the difference of these 2 events are and like how they're the same, how they're different?
Well, I think Chicago is geared not only to all sporting artifacts, primarily decoys. It started as a decoy show and it spread from there. But you can find everything at Chicago, whether it be fish traps or old signs or duck calls, turkey calls, decoys, whatever, cigar store Indians.
Yeah.
Versus this is very specialized towards more contemporary current call makers. It's dedicated to the art of call making. And that's what John loves, John Stevens from RnT. That's his deal, is bringing back the art of call making.
I guess it's promoting that and trying to bring more people aware of that and into that fold. And
well, guys that have a common bond, they share a lot of information. That's one beautiful thing about this collecting fraternity is that they're more than willing to share. In the old days, guys didn't like to share stuff. And today, these guys are more than happy. Guys like Brad Samples, they will teach you from the ground up how to build a call. And they love to share that information and knowledge. And it may have taken them 15 years to get where they're at today, but they will tell you everything that you need to know to get started. And that's great, to share that. And that's what this is all about.
Yeah, that's really neat. So you get to so you're learning from makers about why they make things the way they do and what they're making. And then on the other end of that, as I'm guessing, did collectors bring some calls here to show each other? And
John Stevens is a tremendous vintage call collector. He has a incredible collection, which is on display here. And he loves that part of it. But on the other hand, he makes a living selling duck calls and making duck calls.
Right.
So, he promotes the vintage call side of it as well, but we don't have quite the turnout here of vintage call guys as we do contemporary call guys.
So is it similar to Chicago and will y'all actually trade at all or
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so you'll have everything.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah. And there'll be a section here for vintage calls.
Yeah.
And there'll be hundreds and hundreds.
You got your eye on
calls.
anything?
I don't, because they're not set up yet. But I do know a few things that are coming.
But you know, I was going to say, I know how all of y'all work, and you've already talked about it.
Oh, absolutely. I want to buy what's under the table, not what's on top of it.
That's what I mean. I was like, because I've been around you guys. I know you've already had those conversations.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Did you bring anything for anyone else?
I brought a couple.
Yeah. Going to make some deals.
Of course. Yeah. And that's the fun part of it. And that's one of the reasons I got into call collecting, is because for me, it's getting to hunt 12 months of the year versus I can only hunt ducks 120 days, but I can hunt calls all year long. So that's the fun part for me.
As Ryan says, the other duck season.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's go back and give us your intro into the outdoor world, hunting, and all of that. So let's go all the way back.
All the way back. Well,
all the way back. Introduce us to you.
I got involved with the outdoors. I think probably 7 or 8 years old, with my grandfather up in Nebraska and my uncle who lived in Montana. My parents didn't hunt. My dad didn't shoot, any of that stuff. So it was very unusual for me to go that direction. But because of watching them shoot, I fell in love with the idea of hunting and being outdoors and getting to know that side of modern life. And it just always stuck with me. I started archery hunting when I was about 10, 11 years old. I started field archery and then actually killed my first deer with a bow when I was 12 years old in Colorado, which is where I'm from. And
it's even harder to do.
Yeah. I was very lucky. But anyway, the deer ran into my arrow. It's funny because I had shot all my arrows at squirrels and grouse.
Oh, yeah.
And I had one arrow left when a deer actually happened to walk under my deer stand.
How excited was 12-year-old you?
They'll probably have to cut this, but I sat in the tree stand. The deer jumped my arrow, and it hit him square in the butt.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but it hit the femoral artery.
Right, okay.
And he ran about 50 yards and laid down. And I didn't know femoral artery from carotid. So I sat and went, wow, I think he's going to die. His head's, So I took out my huge giant Bowie knife, which had to be very cool at that age.
Yes.
And I carved into the tree, "Let It Bleed," which was a popular Beatles song at the time.
Yeah,
I think it was "Let It Be," but maybe.
It was "Let It Be," but.
Okay, yeah. At that point, it wasn't.
That's great. I love that story.
So anyway, I went from archery to, I got into a very unusual sport through a friend of mine in junior high school, falconry and birds of prey.
Yeah.
So I got to enjoy the only blood sport that you can release a head of game unharmed. You can trade the bird off for another piece of meat, release the rabbit, release the duck, whatever. And that, it is the oldest sport.
Yeah.
So I did that for many, many, many years and pursued not only long wing falcons, but hawks. And I got into hunting ducks with the birds, which was an extreme thrill. There was nothing to me more exciting than watching a falcon come down from 1,000-foot stoop where she was just a dot in the sky and you couldn't see her, but you could hear the bells on her legs and you could hear the whistling of her wings when she came down diving for ducks. And so that is how I really got to enjoy the outdoors, to be part of nature in its truest sense.
Right, yeah. You're like, literally witnessing nature.
To get to witness something that most people will never ever see.
So I asked this to a lot of people about that moment when they're in the outdoors. And it seems to be a similar answer, but you probably have a little bit of a unique one with where you start, where you just kind of have that awe-inspiring moment where you just kind of, I don't know. It's hard to explain a name for that moment that makes you fall in love, but I would think
it was early.
Yeah.
And it wasn't my deer hunting with a bow, but it was flying a falcon. She had made her first real kill because she was what they call an IS bird that I raised as a young bird.
Okay.
And so she didn't know how to hunt. I had to teach her to hunt. And in other words, I was the mother.
Okay. Yeah.
Teaching the young falcon how to hunt. So it took a lot of time. And the very first wonderful stoop that she made and killed a drake mallard, I sat on the side of that pond just in total awe. And looking around, I was all by myself, never flew a bird with other people. You kind of did. It was a loner sport, just because of the nature of it. It's very uncompetitive. It's you and the bird. And I sat on the side of the pond just in total awe and just fell in love. I'm at the foot of the Rockies in Colorado.
Yeah, that's a pretty
around
idyllic setting.
A beautiful pond all by myself. And that's where I got really in love with everything wild.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, okay, tell me about training a falcon to hunt. What does that entail?
Training a bird of prey is unlike training any other animal because it's all based on conditioned response.
Okay.
You cannot, if your falcon's a bad girl, you can't spank her.
Right. Yeah.
Not and do it more than once because she's gone. She can just fly away. And it's conditioned response where the bird is kept not hungry, but keen.
Okay.
So there's a fine line there between starving a bird to do what you want it to do and keeping her keen and in good condition, because if she's not in good condition, she can't catch game.
Right. So, yeah, she has to be healthy and strong. All right.
Exactly. So it's all based on conditioned response to where you have trained them to come to you for food if they miss the intended quarry, which happens a lot. They only are successful maybe every third or fourth time, less than that in the wild.
Okay.
But a well-trained falcon will come back to a lure, come back to a live lure if she's missed the head of game that she's after. So it's all conditioned response. You're offering her food, and she's coming to you.
Okay. And do they imprint like on you? Like, is that
a
how it
young
works?
bird absolutely will, and those are the least desirable birds there are.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely, because they have no manners.
Okay.
It's like an untrained kid. It's wild and
like
crazy.
having a toddler.
Yeah, they scream all the time.
Yeah, I got a couple of those.
Try the conditioned response part.
Yeah, they don't work. The potty training's been real fun. So, yeah, okay. I would have thought of the opposite, though. I would have thought the imprinting would have been...
No. As a matter of fact...
Because, like, with a lab, like, the loyalty there...
There's no loyalty with the bird of prey. They're a wild animal that you have trained to be able to come live in their world.
So do you have is there an alpha response, or I guess but birds don't have that.
No, they don't. And there are a couple of species of birds of prey that do become somewhat attached to you.
Yeah, because they're solitary animals.
Very solitary. Harris hawk is one, and a gyrfalcon is the other. They will become actually closer than any other species of bird, but they are wild and they can fly away at any time. And I had that experience. The very first flight off of a long line, they never looked back.
Oh, that's pretty disappointing. You all that
a
work
month and a half,
like...
2 months of training for a bird that you trap out of the wild that already knows how to hunt is a much better hunter, much better behaved, and they're the ideal bird to fly.
I just actually learned this is actually really timely, because I learned this yesterday, how you trap them. Because well, I didn't know this because we have an intern right now in the science department at Ducks Unlimited, and he is an ornithologist. And Nick Wiley also I forget his title right now, but it'll come to me later. But he's used to be chief scientist, and now he's like chief operating officer maybe. But anyway, they were going to tag something. They were going to ban a couple of predatory birds, and you basically put a mouse in a cage
with nooses all over it.
With nooses. I was like, I didn't realize. Yeah, that's how they did it.
Yeah, that's called a ball shattery.
Okay, a ball shattery.
Yes,
learned a new term today.
There you go.
So yesterday I learned what the thing was and how.
Yep.
And he did it himself. They tried the newer version of how to trap them, and then that didn't work. So they're going back to the old mouse from the pet store.
That works.
Little nooses. Yeah.
Yep. Whatever. But yeah, it was a very, very inspiring hobby to be in. I won't call it a hobby sport.
Yeah.
Loved it, but it's very, very time consuming. So when I got into business in my mid-20s, for myself. I didn't have time to train the birds adequately. It's a full-time job, literally, when you're flying falcons.
So do you have multiple when you're doing it, or you just have one that you're working with?
You could only at that time have 2 birds of prey. There were several levels of falconer. A novice, you had to serve internships underneath a master falconer.
Wow. Okay.
So you were an apprentice, then you became a general.
This is not for the light of heart.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
It really is. There's multiple tests you have to take, and you have to have a big facility to home the birds, house the birds in, proper equipment, that type of thing. But it got me involved heavily into the outdoors, and that's where I transitioned into the firearms world, because I had to give up the birds timing-wise to run a business, which so happened to be a firearms business.
Yeah, so when did you become interested in firearms? Because, I mean, you're doing all this. Are you becoming interested during this at the same time, like simultaneously?
Yes, semi-simultaneously, because, of course, you used guns at certain times to get food for the birds or whatever.
Okay,
So
that makes sense.
I was raised with pellet rifles on
You're
up.
not going to the pet store and...
No, mice are too expensive. I did raise quail. That works real well, because bird of prey you can't just feed her hamburger, she'll die.
Yeah.
You can't just feed her nothing but steak, she'll die, because birds of prey have to have roughage.
Okay.
Because
That makes sense.
their system is designed around all those bones and fur going together and creating what's called a casting that they
The pellets, yeah.
come back out, and that's what cleans out their digestive tract. So it's necessary that you get wild game that has small bones and fur and whatnot.
Yeah, and I'm guessing they don't want anything dead. They want...
Well, they'll definitely eat stuff you put in the freezer, like a duck or a rabbit.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. To them, meat's meat. If you hand it to them, they're happy.
Yeah, and it's just, and you're a young kid, though. It's cheaper just to go hunt for them.
Exactly. Yeah.
So were you growing up, growing up, like, in the country area? Like, or were you in the city? Like, how were you?
I lived in the suburbs to where I could walk and be in wide open fields and that type of thing. Yeah. At the edge of suburbia, which is now the middle of
Right. I'm sure.
Denver.
Yeah. It's not suburbia anymore.
Nope.
Okay. That makes sense. All right. So when you get into firearms, where does your interest first go?
I started in the firearms business, and that's where I learned good stuff from bad stuff, and I became a collector. Obviously, you fall in love with certain classes of firearms, which at first became lever-action rifles, because that was one of my first real guns that my dad gave to me was a Marlin 22 lever-action rifle, Model 39. I started collecting Marlin rifles, and then I mature into nicer, although the Marlins were very high-end guns towards the end.
Yeah, I was like, now you're okay, yeah.
Which my entire Marlin collection went to Richard Ellis.
Yeah,
and
our friend Richard.
He sold that back in 1999. And I fell in love with double guns, whether they be shotguns or double rifles, but my true love is double rifles, which they look like side-by-side shotguns, but they shoot rifle cartridges.
All right. So why double rifle?
They were the highest form of quality firearm building back in the day.
So
the craftsmanship was phenomenal. All the good guns were built in England pre-World War II, pre-1930, even pinpoint it further. They were sold to the elite, princes, princesses, maharajas, and India and whatnot. And so that to me became what I wanted to collect primarily. And after the Marlin collection, I went into double rifles.
So can you narrow it down even more in double rifles? Like
big calibers.
Big calibers.
Heavy,
okay.
Yeah, heavy, dangerous game guns.
Okay. All right. That's cool. And then what are the makers of, because I don't know much.
There's several companies back in the day that built the highest quality, Holland & Holland, Purdy, Rigby,
Okay.
Jeffries. They built side-by-side shotguns as well as double rifles.
So would they have because you talk about this, there's one guy that makes it. Is he making them for each? Is there a guy at each place, or is he kind of making?
Yeah, no, it's somewhat like today's manufacturing process, where you'll have several stations, but one guy would typically build the gun from start to finish.
Okay.
He would be capable of stocking it, barreling it, doing the action, mating the action to the barrels, regulating the gun, engraving the gun. They were real craftsmen in those days.
So
it's a cottage industry.
Yeah. So that's what I'm asked. I guess what I'm wondering is, since they'd have this one guy that specialized in this, so was he training the guys that end up going to different manufacturers?
Absolutely.
Okay.
They had apprentices, just like it is today as far as carrying on the tradition.
Okay.
And then it got a little more broken up to where there was a guy that did the barrels and one guy did the stocking. But in the early days, it was one guy did it from start to finish, and he would wear a trench around his bench, walking around working on that gun.
That's such a lost.
Oh, it's totally
art.
Lost art.
Yeah.
And there are no companies today that build guns by hand.
No.
It's all CNC equipment. And
yeah, I just wonder, this younger generation of hunters love the old stuff. And it's been really interesting, 'cause we just did a camo exhibit, and they buying up all the old camo, and they just love the old style things.
Well, camo manufacturers would probably want to shoot me for saying this, but my granddad hunted in a red and black lumberjack jacket. There was no such thing as scents or atomizers to cover your scent or any of that stuff. It was the number one scent was keep the wind in your face, and your problems are solved. You don't have to worry about all this stuff. So I don't know. I love the old stuff too.
Yeah, I do too. That's really interesting. Well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and get more into the calls.
Absolutely love to.
Stay tuned to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, after these messages.
Where are we going from here?
Calls.
Okay.
So when did you get into call collecting, calls in general? How did that evolution?
My call collecting started, I guess, more of as an assortment than as a collection, because in my younger days growing up, I'd try a call, and if it didn't work for me, I'd throw it in a drawer and buy another one. And they were cheap plastic, acrylic calls back in those days. And before long, I had probably 20, 30, 40 calls in a drawer. And my dad finally gave me a set of Iverson matched pair duck and goose call, checkered, that was made out of rosewood, and it was just gorgeous. And that is probably my first set of real collectible type duck calls. Even though they were made in the 70s, they were still, beautiful and a work of art. And I couldn't bring myself to hunt them. They didn't blow to my style anyway, but I put them up on a shelf in my bedroom and thought, darn, I got that drawer full of calls. I'll put them up there with them. And that's how my collecting started. So I just took off from there.
That's crazy that your dad, who doesn't hunt, bought you Iverson.
Did not hunt, but he knew that I loved, and he promoted my hunting. I mean, he'd take me hunting.
Yeah,
and just, pick me up later.
Okay.
And, as a real young kid, I can remember him dropping me and my friend off to go duck hunting, and his dad would come back and pick us up at the end of the weekend. And we lived off the land for
that's
the
crazy.
whole weekend, Friday to Saturday or Sunday night. And
that's amazing.
So, I've just really enjoyed the art of duck calls, and whether it be, I'm primarily a vintage call collector, but you get to a point where they're harder and harder to find. And so I've moved a little bit into more of the contemporary calls, but primarily the higher end collectible.
So
custom, high art, beautiful woods, checkering, that type of thing.
Okay. So after you decide, you make the personal statement that I'm going to put these up here and I'm going to start collecting calls. Where do you go from there? Like what avenue do you start going down? Like types of calls you start collecting?
Well, I started looking at other avenues. Okay, these are beautiful calls. What else is out there?
Okay.
So you start looking in trade journals, and that was just prior to eBay.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was not available quite yet. But I found out about the show in Chicago and would travel to that, and you could always find good old calls there and very collectible. And I started following books on duck calls and
so Howard Harlan's type.
The Howard
books.
Harlan, Donna Tonelli, Jim Fleming had a book on more contemporary current call makers at that time. I started collecting in 95.
Okay.
Seriously collecting. So I've been doing it a while, and there were several shows around the country that you could go to and find duck calls, vintage duck calls.
Right, because you're in Colorado, so
Correct.
you're not going to find many call collectors in that area.
In a way, that's a blessing because I didn't have a loyalty to Illinois calls or Arkansas calls.
Yeah.
I loved them all. It didn't matter. If it was made in Minnesota, I loved it. If it was made in Arkansas, I loved it. So I didn't have to have a loyalty and focus my collection on just Tennessee calls. I wanted them all. And I went to pawn shops. I went to flea markets, wherever I thought I could find a call. And believe it or not, Colorado, a lot of people from this part of the world retired in Colorado, Estes Park or somewhere like that. So, we come across a few out there. I've come across some really nice old calls.
Yeah, I wouldn't think about that.
No,
yeah. But
you
you
don't.
have no competition.
Oh, there's a few other call collectors.
Yeah, but even in 95?
Oh, yeah. There was a couple. I ran into a guy actually at a flea market. I saw a duck call 2 or 3 tables up, and I was making my move, and this guy beat me to it. And it's like, what are you doing? Are you a duck hunter? That's not a good duck call for duck hunting. He says, no, I collect these. And it's like, oh, okay. So, and we got to be friends.
Okay, that's my next question. You got to be friends.
We got to be friends and duck hunting partners at the time.
Oh, that's amazing. So that's another thing I find common with collectors. You usually find either a friend or a mentor early on. Was that similar for you because you were in Colorado, or how did that work?
I got to know guys across the country, Joe Tonelli, Bob Christensen, these guys that had been doing it for years longer than I had, Howard Harlan, and learned from them.
Okay.
And pretty much got their leftovers.
Yeah.
If they already had it in their collection, they'd call me and say, hey, I ran across another one of these. Are you interested?
Okay.
So that's how I'd track down calls. It was very much a networking thing. Like I said, it was pre-eBay.
Right.
Once eBay hit, it became a lot easier, just like a lot of things did. And in the early days of eBay, it was pretty easy to come up with some nice calls. Now it's not quite as easy.
Yeah, it's a much different situation.
But the beautiful thing about collecting duck calls or even decoys or old guns, whatever it is, they're still out there. There's still phenomenal calls coming to market, fresh, what they call fresh to the market.
There are, there wasn't a good decoy, but yesterday I was in the museum. I go to the museum every morning, check on exhibits, just kind of show my face. And this guy came up to me and had a picture of some Masons. This is what he had. He didn't know what he had.
Right.
But I mean, they were just standard, repainted, a couple bills replaced. They weren't worth anything, but he has them. And he has no idea what they are. So that's eventually one of those guys who has 3 decoys or 3 calls from his grandfather.
You never know.
They're going to be something nice.
The sad thing about decoys with the advent, the old wooden blocks that they hunted over in those days. The sad thing about those is when the plastic decoys hit the market, they got burned up in fireplaces. What do I do with these old things?
I know.
They just went into a fireplace and got burned up. Duck calls have always been useful. Yeah. So I think it's easier to find.
They don't also keep you warm very long.
No, not worth burning. And they fit in a drawer easier.
Yes. Yeah, that is. We were talking about that. I interviewed Gigi Hopkins. Do you know who she is? Yeah, wonderful interview. I very recommend listening to it. But we lamented over the fact that every story of a collector ends up with, and the sack of decoys was burned. Like
We had a bunch of those, but we burned them.
Yeah, we burned them. It's a very sad story, but you're right. It's a very different way of going about it, because a lot of times when people recommend to collectors to get started, they recommend to find your niche, so you're not buying everywhere and buying a lot of things that don't, waste your money on things. But you didn't go that way. You went a different way. So, okay, how would you describe your evolution of collecting and how you decided what you're going to collect and what you're going to keep, what you're going to sell? Like, how did you decide to fine tune?
I had a conversation when I first got started collecting. It didn't matter if it went quack. I wanted it.
Okay.
And before long, I had several hundred duck calls that were virtually worth it. They're $30, $40 calls.
Yeah.
And I was talking to Joe Tonelli one night on the phone. And he says, "You need to slow down." He said...
He probably said it not as nice as that.
No, not quite as nicely. Ryan can do a much better job.
He can do a great Joe Tonelli.
Yeah. So he said, stop and think of what you're doing here. At the rate you're going, you're going to have 2,000 duck calls in no time flat, but you're going to have a lot of nothing.
Right.
Air.
Yeah.
And that's great if that's what you want, but I didn't want that. I wanted higher end stuff. And he says, stop buying, get rid of those, trade for, maybe it'll take 10 of those to get one of these, but in the long run, you'd rather have it.
Right.
So I'm not a firm believer in more is not better, but my wife tells me that. So I decided, okay, I'm going to focus on the better calls, checkered calls, artsier calls, more famous calls, by rarer calls, that type of thing. And that's kind of where I went. I still have over 2,000 calls, but they're high-end calls, and not so much of the lower-end stuff. If somebody like Charles Grubbs made low-end calls and high-end calls, well, I want them all. But he's a real famous guy in duck call history versus Falks, or I just want the high-end Falks, the old Falks, stamped calls, that type of thing.
Yeah, okay.
So,
because that's a lot of variety of style. Do you have a preferred style of call?
Without a question, checkered, sexy looking.
So Arkansas, or no? Or do you like
my favorite duck call?
Yeah, what's your favorite?
All around is, without a doubt, an Ira Ferguson. That is the cream of the crop for me. I love carved Perdues. I've got a lot of carved Perdues, including crown stoppers, but the checkered winged panel calls, hookers, carved calls, those are incredible. Beckhart carved calls, those are the ones are my favorite.
Okay.
Head and shoulders above the rest.
So that's you're looking for that. Are you still looking for that white well of that Beckert out there?
I've already got it.
You already got it. When did you get
the finest duck call ever made?
Yes.
Was a call that JT made for family.
Yeah, the three. Oh, there's two.
There's two known. Supposedly one unknown.
Yes, that's what I mean, yes. And you've got one of them.
That is, without a doubt, the finest duck call ever made. And new in the box.
You have it in the box.
Nobody had ever seen a JT Beckhart box.
No.
Big Lake duck call that was absolutely brand new in the box.
So you have one of them. The other one is with Jay Cucci's collection.
Jay Cucci's collection. It came into auction at Chicago.
Well, the audience can't see this, but I'm looking at it, and yep, that's it. Oh my gosh.
That, to me, is the finest duck call in existence.
Well, I don't think it's just to you. I think that's to the collecting community.
It's the Holy Grail.
Yeah, it's the Holy Grail.
But there's one more out there supposedly.
Is. That's what I said. The white well of duck call collecting is still floating
But does
around.
it have a box, and is it brand new?
Who knows?
Yeah.
Yes,
Don't know.
We don't know.
Don't know.
So I forget. It was two. Was it for his daughters? As he made 3 of them?
I don't remember if it was for his daughter. I actually bought it from a family member.
Yeah, it was 3.
That came to me.
Okay.
And that call has a really funny story. It had been stolen from the family. The guy put it on eBay. Everybody thought it was fake, of course. Some people knew it wasn't. And the police tracked him down, got the call because of his eBay posting, and returned it to the family.
Oh, my gosh.
And a couple years later, I had seen the call and knew about it, but he didn't have the box pictured. But that family member contacted me and said, "Are you interested in this call? The family wants to diversify themselves of it. It's become a real issue." And I said, "Absolutely." And he came from back here all the way out to Colorado to hand deliver it, and I got it.
Wow.
So
what a phone call to receive.
Yeah,
when was this?
Oh, that's been 20 years ago, at least. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
aren't you lucky?
rather have luck than skill.
That's true. That's 100% true. I did not realize that you were the one who had that call. I should have known that, honestly.
No.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's pride and joy.
Yeah, I would have.
Although I have several others that, again, Ferguson's.
Right. No,
if there's one call you can look at and put a finger on who made that call, it's an Ira Ferguson.
Right. Yeah, it has a very
unique. Very few of them out there. He made it in both Arkansas style and real foot style. And I've got both of those. I think there's only a couple of the Arkansas style.
Yeah, so they're mostly real foot styles, what I've seen.
Refill. Yep. Very, very beautiful call.
Yeah. I wonder where that other Beck heard it.
Who knows?
Hopefully it didn't get burnt in a fire.
Fell in a lake. Who knows?
Yes.
Even though that was a very expensive call in its day, that was probably a $10 call.
Yes. Yeah.
So, although it was made for family, people didn't look at things like they do today. They weren't collectors. They didn't collect things like we do now.
No, that was a utilitarian object. It was a tool with a purpose.
A pretty tool for family.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he just made that special for
And it sat in a drawer in a sock, wrapped up in a sock for 70, 80 years.
Well, it's like the other one that Jay Cucci has was in a woman's underwear drawer for years. All right. So now at your point in collecting, what is it that you're searching for?
What am I looking for?
Yeah, what are you looking for?
At this point, pretty much duplicates of the higher end calls. I will never pass the opportunity at a Pickle or another Clifford or something like that. But I would say there's a few makers that I'm missing, not as important to me as the other ones because they may be plainer or whatever. But the high art calls will always interest me.
Yeah.
And it's trade material.
Yeah.
It's also trade material.
Yeah. So, I know from talking to Ryan, because that's really how he built his collection is by
amassing.
Yes.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
That helps you to get the next big one you want.
Sure.
It's a business in a way.
Well, kind of. Yeah,
but
but your focus is on getting more.
Exactly.
And all of them.
Right.
There's no such thing as too many duck calls.
I bet your wife disagrees with that.
No, she doesn't.
She does not.
She thoroughly enjoys
You're
it.
lucky that way, too.
Well, she's a hunter. So, as a matter of fact, she's guided Ryan Graves.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That makes me very happy. There's not a lot of women hunters out there. It makes me happy.
Of course, with Ryan, she had to say, "Are you going to shoot these ducks going by? Because you're on your phone and my dog wants a retrieve."
It's over there whining.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, she loves to hunt. She's big turkey hunter, waterfowl hunter. She says she does it for the dog, but I don't know if I believe that. But that's, to me, waterfowl hunting is about dog work. And I love that.
It is. I grew up and we never got to have it. My dad would never train a dog. And he goes, he had 2 children and we were the dogs for many, many years. And it's back.
Yeah. You know how to call her again.
So my brother, when he got to college and had his own money, he bought, I guess right out of college, he had his own money and had the time to train one when he was in grad school. And that first dog, I love that dog so much. It was the first time, we never really had a dog. And we were finally, we got to feel what it was like to
you weren't the dog anymore.
Yes, it was so, I love that dog so much. It was very different, which people are usually surprised to hear that because I grew up hunting. I'm like, yeah, like no, my dad would never
get a dog.
He would never get a dog.
It's I think it's a huge part of waterfowling today is the dog work, and it always has been. But a good dog makes a big difference. Oh, absolutely.
And a bad dog makes.
Yeah, a bad dog will ruin a hunt. But yeah, just to watch their desire and their ability, it's just incredible. And my dog, and I swear I never trained her to do this, picks up the decoys. But she will swim through those decoys to pick up a duck on the far side. I never told her to do this. She learned it on her own, and she knows when the hunt is over.
Oh, wow.
When you get out of the blind, she starts picking up decoys. The only downside is she has sharp teeth, and I'm constantly putting clear silicone on tooth marks to keep them from sinking. But yeah, things like that, that's all part of the whole experience to get to enjoy that.
So another question I like to really ask collectors is kind of advice for people that want to get in, especially because we're at Callapalooza, and this will be an event that has people like might get interested in collecting. What is your advice you would give to somebody that's interested?
Probably be a little bit more specific, whether it's contemporary calls, vintage calls, whatever. Everybody starts out like I did, where they just get as many calls as they can, but focus. Pick something and focus on it, and rather than I would much rather have one high-end call than 100 low-end calls, because 100 calls takes up a lot of display space versus one call, and down the road I think that's probably, I see this in firearms, high-end firearms versus middle-of-the-road firearms. The market will go flat in the middle, and there's always somebody for the low end. And there's always somebody for the high end. Yeah. But the middle of the road stuff can fall flat. And it's the same with decoys. It's the same with firearms.
Yeah, you're right. I was looking at, did you look at Leland Little's auction today at all?
No, did not.
It was very like exactly what you're saying. It was, they had a lot of long rifles in there, which I'm not particularly interested, but you probably would have been. But yeah, it was like the high end stuff, like exactly as you would expect it.
Right.
The low end stuff, stayed at that. And then it was definitely flat.
We hear so much about how flat the economy is and blah, 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 blah. You know what? The air's thinner at the top. Yeah. But there's still a lot of people out there with a lot of money. And
they still buy them.
These high-end firearms, there's only so many of them out there. And it's just like high-end duck calls. There's only so many of them out there. Wow. Those will always command a huge premium. And they're going up at a huge rate. So it's not only a collection that you get to enjoy and part of what you love, but you got to look at it as an investment.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to.
The last few, like Guy and Dieter, even Copley has had calls lately. Sure. What are your thoughts on calls coming into these bigger auctions? Like they're typically decoys and sporting art.
I see it. Well, I mean, it is folk art. It is sporting art.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
So it belongs there.
It does belong there. But it's new, really, to there.
Fairly new.
Guy and Dieter has done it much longer.
Much, much longer. But Steve O'Brien had some great duck calls 20 years ago.
Oh, did he?
When he first started, yeah. Okay. I bought several really nice calls from him. But I think it's a great avenue for everybody to get a shot at something. Jump in there and play. And yeah, it's probably going to bring top dollar unless people are sleeping, but it gives everybody a chance to play. Yeah. And it's a great avenue for people to dispose of a collection, whatever. That I see it in the firearms market.
Yeah.
More and more and more every day. And there's new firearms auctioneers coming on board.
Guy and Dieter just started doing a full firearms.
Well, that made sense for them.
It did make perfect sense. Like I talked to John several times, and he would say, like, we'd have to basically step over shotguns to get the decoys,
and that made no sense.
Yeah,
and especially Wes Dillon's a duck hunting friend of mine, partner, and he comes and hunts. We hunt a lot together. Yeah, he's a great guy, and probably the most knowledgeable firearms guy I have ever met. He actually started the Cabela's Gun Library.
Okay,
and then moved to be the curator of James Julia's auction for the firearms division. So super knowledgeable guy. He's handled more high-end, one-of-a-kind type guns than anybody I know. When I was at the Colorado Gun Collectors Show just a week ago, there were probably 10 or 12 booths that were auctioners coming on.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't just, Richie's or Guyette and Dieter. It was, Poulin's, of course, is huge. There were people I'd never heard of. And so there's and again, that's online stuff. A lot of it's online. But there's auctions all over the country for firearms, and you'll see it happening with decoys and duck calls and sporting art and everything else. So it's just inevitable.
Yeah, I talked to John a lot about what you're going to do. Oh, gosh, I just forgot his name. That works for John, does decoyforsale.com. And the impact that has had on new collectors. Anyway, I have it.
Dave Nebo?
No.
Okay.
It's a young guy that he is kind of running that, and I can picture his face right now.
Oh, yeah, okay, with Guyette and Dieter.
With Guyette and Dieter, he's running that. Okay. But he's running Decoys for Sale, and we were talking kind of like the impact that it had on new collectors, and it's good. I think it's a good thing.
It's great. It's like eBay.
Yeah, but it's eBay with security.
Yeah, exactly, and that's. You don't get that everywhere.
No.
And that's what I tell people that ask me about firearms. Is this auction, is this a good gun for me to buy? And it's like, you know what? I can't tell from a picture if it's been reblued, refinished, whatever. But do they honor their description? If they say it's an original gun, do they honor that?
Right.
And that's who you want to deal with. And Guyette and Dieter, those guys, they all
Steven,
they all write great descriptions and they live with it.
Yeah.
If you get the item and it's not what they described it as, you get to return it.
Yeah.
So that's huge.
It's very
it's
big.
Insurance.
Yes, exactly. Well, all right. So I've taken up a lot of your time, and
no worries if you've
really
got more.
Good.
Ask. I don't know if we covered what you wanted.
So is there anything that you would like to add for our audience?
Other than I think it's great what you're doing. I think that's really cool. It opens things up to a lot more people that have never been exposed to duck calls. Now they're getting exposed to it because a lot of people follow you. That's huge. I
mean, I grew up in Ducks Unlimited, and I grew up duck hunting, which our audience obviously knows. But I grew up in the Mississippi Delta, and we are strangely void of historic calls and decoy making. It's an odd little hole in the waterfowl world.
A lot of that is because the time length that has passed since those calls were so widely used, they've scattered all over the country.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing where I have found high-end, beautiful, quality vintage duck calls from all over the country. And I think a lot of it is because Arizona.
Yeah.
People went to retire in Arizona. They lived in
So basically
Mass
you're telling me I need to go to Florida and
everywhere. Find the cotton tops and say, what have you got in your drawer?
That's his advice, guys.
No,
I was kidding. Well, all right. This has been really fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it immensely.
All right. Thanks, Len, for coming on this show. Thanks to our producer, Chris Isaac. And thanks to you, our listeners, for supporting wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to the DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit ducks.org/DU Podcast. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks.